Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center for this online event. How should the United States approach the China-Russia partnership? Held in partnership with the new Eurasian Strategies Center. I'm your moderator, Andrew Danieri, Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We have a superb panel of experts today for this event, and I'm excited to introduce them. We have Sergei Alexashenko, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Economics at the new Eurasian Strategies Center, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, Sarah Kirchberger, a non-resident Senior Fellow in the Geostrategy Initiative and Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council, and John Loff, a Senior Research Fellow and Head of Foreign Policy and International Partnerships at the new Eurasian Strategies Center. So lots of good AC Nest synergy here. We have 1 hour for today's discussion. I'm going to kick things off with our panelists first with a moderated discussion and then welcome questions from our virtual audience in the second part of the event. Please send your questions into askac.org. That's askac.org to submit your questions, and I will pitch them to our panelists. We're going to start with Sergei and with John because they're the two lead authors on a new report called Marriage Without Love, the Sino-Russian Partnership and What It Means for the World. Sergei, maybe can you kick us off with a very brief comment on the report, and then we'll move to John? And just unmute yourself real quick.
Sorry, Andrew. We agreed with John that he will start first, because he will give broad overview. I am very narrow-minded economist that may be not very interesting for our audience.
All right, Mr. Loff, for the overview then. You should also unmute if you can.
Is that good?
Yes, all good.
Okay, many thanks for this opportunity to present our recent report. We prepared the report for the Munich Security Conference, where we held a couple of events, side events on the subject. Just a quick word about the Nest Center before we get started. We were established in June 2024 with seed funding from Mikhail Hodorkovsky. The goal of the center is to bring top quality Russian expertise to the Western policy discussion about Russia, and we're present in both London and Washington, DC. The aim of the report is to get under the hood of China-Russia relations and to understand better the direction of the relationship and its sustainability, and really to answer the question, has the relationship peaked or not? And the analysis looks at mutual perceptions, the economic dimension of the partnership, that's Sergei's part, and the challenges overall to the relationship. And I think the headline that we have is that the Russia-China relationship, or this partnership, is not a strategic alliance, and it's not going to become one. The close alignment between Russia and China that we see today is reactive in nature. It's driven by both countries' sense of confrontation with the so-called collective West, and in Russia's case in particular by the consequences of the war against Ukraine. But Moscow and Beijing have different long-term objectives, and I think it's important to identify them. China is a pragmatic, revisionist power. It wants to bring about a managed transformation of the international order to advance its role in the global economy, while Russia relies primarily on military power, and it wants the right to veto any situation it sees as affecting its interests. And importantly, it sees disorder as a tool to raise its influence. So I think in short, the interaction between Russia and China is transactional, it's limited in scope, but it's marked by a persistent and indeed growing asymmetry with Russia in a subordinate position. Economic ties between the two countries are based on the natural complementarity of the countries. These ties are resilient, but we believe they're close to their upper limit. Bilateral trade is highly dependent on global oil price dynamics, And it's not translated, in fact, into broad-based investment or technological cooperation. Chinese investment, in fact, in Russia is remarkably low. Sergei did a little sort of calculation of the number of Chinese investments. I think since 2014, if I remember correctly, that were above 500 million. And I believe there were only 6 that were in that category. So overall, it's that investment is extremely low. And at the same time, China treats Russia as an undesirable competitor in industrial manufacturing, but of course as a useful supplier of raw materials. And now in the current situation with events in the Middle East, possibly an even more useful supplier of crude oil. The shared anti-Western positions do not offset the mutual distrust that is shaped by historical traumas and the cultural distance. We believe that over time these factors may gradually weaken, but they're likely to constrain any deepening of relations, at least over the medium term. So in other words, this Sino-Russian partnership is stable, but it's shallow. There's no political foundation to it, no shared strategic vision, and no institutional infrastructure to sustain deeper alignment. And I think it's striking that this sort of asymmetry in relations extends beyond the bilateral relationship itself. We can see in Central Asia, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, that China is steadily replacing Moscow's old ideological and, if you like, security footprint, because it offers capital, infrastructure, long-term developments that the Russian development projects that the Russian state simply can't match. And so we think that as far as the trajectory of the relationship is concerned, the most likely medium-term scenario is a stable but limited partnership, and largely one that's declaratory in nature. So the formation of a genuine military political alliance between the two countries we regard as highly unlikely. So in short, we believe that Russia's pivot to the east, this much proclaimed pivot to the east, is neither ideological nor civilizational. It's not a redefinition of Russia's national identity or its geostrategic orientation. And in addition, I think this is important, China doesn't view Russia as part of its civilizational sphere. And Russia's own elite culture and its long-term aspirations, despite the current problems in relations with the West, I think remain strongly tied, in fact, to the West. So the absence of, let me just finish, the absence of clear Western strategies towards Russia and China, we think increases the risk of a possibly unintended negative outcome, which is deeper Russian dependence on China, something that China doesn't in fact want. So I'll leave it to Sergei to comment on the economic side of things. Thank you.
Yeah, I think stable and shallow might be a nice little label for this. Sergei, please give us your insights.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, John, for the nice preface. And you left not a lot of ideas that I can share as an introductory statement. I would add one very important thing, that when Putin decided to pivot Russia to the east in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, his belief was that China could replace the West in both finances and technology. But he underestimated that when Russian companies, Russian banks were going to the West, they were dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, companies, banks, investors, and so on and so far. If you need to place euro bonds or to sell your equities, you go to the road shows, you present your plans, you present your financials, and you negotiate with hundreds of investors, and some of them decide to invest in Russia, in Russian assets. If you want to go to China, if you want to raise money from China, you need to go to the Communist Party and to agree with them. Without any agreement, without the agreement with leaders of the CPC, you cannot raise substantial finances from Chinese banks. They are not ready to do it. Of course, they can provide you trade financing, very short term, to purchase Chinese goods, but they are not ready to provide you long-term investment credits if it is not approved by Beijing. And the second very important point is that Beijing is strongly reluctant to provide Russia with any type of industrial technology. Because Beijing believes that if China will provide Russia with access to technology, Russia will produce the same goods as China, and that means is a competition. So Beijing is not ready to give jobs to Russia. He is not interested in this. And there is a very clear statement that trade is very important. Trade is mutually beneficial. Let's develop our trade. And nevertheless, the size of the Russian-Chinese trade, as John said, is limited by the amount of oil that Russia can export to China. And that is once again because of geography is very limited. Russia has a couple of pipelines and a seaport in Far East, Kazmino, through which Russia can export 120 million metric tons of oil per year. Now, that's approximately 2.5, a little bit less, million barrels of oil per day. That is 1/3 of Russian petroleum export, including products, but that's it. Because otherwise, Russia has exporting facilities from Baltic Sea or from Black Sea. That takes a long way, and okay, China has a very short access. Why not to purchase oil from Russia if it's a very short distance? No risk to cut supply lines, and you can bargain discounts from Russia oil. But that's it. And it's a strange story. I have no any explanation for this. This is just my conspiracy theory that for some reasons Chinese export to Russia does not exceed Russian export to China in the recent 5-6 years. So that means that Russia, unlike the United States, has a positive trade balance with China. I don't know, is it intentionally, is it not intentionally? It seems Russia has access to renminbis, to Chinese currency, but Russia as a whole, as an economy, is not purchasing more than it sells to China. So that's why I fully agree with John, who said it's stable but shallow, and I do not see any way to deepen this economic cooperation.
Thank you very much. A nice kind of pithy addition there. Sarah, can I bring you into the conversation now? You're our China expert here. I'd love your reaction to what's been said so far and to the paper as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I should probably upfront say I disagree pretty strongly with the overall take of the report, although I think it is a very valuable report, and in particular, the empirical work on the economic relationship, I think, is really a good contribution to the debate. However, the overall interpretation I see a bit differently, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So I should mention we did a project on Russia-China relations, and the exact question whether this is heading towards something like a strategic alignment or whether it is just opportunistic cooperation a couple of years ago. So our work was done 2019 to 2022. Right when the Ukraine war started, we basically published our study. It's a book, and we had about 20 analysts from 10 different countries, Russia experts, China experts, and military experts working together on this. So that was our project. And actually, at the end of our work, when everyone came together and discussed the results, we had not a single person in that group who did not come to the same conclusion that this is really a steadily deepening entente, de facto alliance, whatever you want to call it. And the thing is, I believe what explains this difference in viewing the same like phenomenon, coming to such different conclusions, I believe one reason is we looked at particular empirical aspects of the relationship, military technology. For instance, I'm a military analyst, military technology analyst. So you look at things a bit differently if you go into the detail of what they're doing together, what is being shared. You look at it differently if you're a sinologist and look at Chinese threat perceptions, their own like military goals and so on. So we had different viewpoints. And I want to highlight a couple of things that I believe are just missing from the picture. And this can lead to you having a different evaluation of this overall relationship. And one of these things is, I believe, some sources of synergy are missing from the analysis. So one thing is China is definitely enabling this war against Ukraine, has been from the beginning. So without the Chinese support, economic support in particular, Russia would no longer be fighting. I believe that is obvious, right? The miltech that has been shared, starting since before 2014, but steadily deepening even before the war in Ukraine, is pretty staggering if you look at the details of it. So right now, Russia is known to have transferred submarine designs, nuclear propulsion for ships, including probably help with the submarine aspect of it, submarine quieting technology. This is technology on a level that even allies within the NATO alliance wouldn't necessarily share with each other. It is not something you can just dismiss as not substantial. And this is just one aspect. There's many more such things. We know from some hackers who obtained documents that Russia has now been supplying airborne landing equipment and technologies to China specifically for a potential Taiwan scenario. And I would like to point out to you, if you've read the book by Christopher Steele of the Trump dossier fame, his book Unredacted, which came out in mid-2024, he mentions in the book that he obtained intelligence directly from Russian sources indicating that China is using North Korea to transfer arms and ammo to Russia, but not be seen as doing so. So of course we have no way of verifying his information. We cannot just go and check on that. But Christopher Steele used to be the Russia head of the MI6, and he says he has direct information from Russia saying that China is basically playing the world, pretending not to be delivering arms and ammo to Russia, but using North Korea as a proxy. So I just mention these things as examples that if you want to basically dismiss that evidence and say it's nothing going on there, it's not important, it doesn't matter, that's fine, but you need to do it directly in the report. You need to mention the facts and you need to explain why it doesn't matter or why it's not important. Just leaving it out and pretending it doesn't exist is not convincing, right? So this is just from the militech and military analysis angle. Another aspect that I find consistently missing in similar reports is China's own relationship with Ukraine and the treaty obligations it has towards Ukraine. That includes security guarantees. And I'm not just talking about the Budapest Memorandum. It's not mentioned as a factor explaining China's attempt to try and not become a part of this conflict on the side of Russia. It's just not mentioned. There's actually a treaty dated from 2013 that has Xi Jinping's personal signature on it that gives Ukraine a security guarantee. So this is probably one of the reasons that constrains China. So I'm sorry, I know I spoke too long, but there are just some of these things that bug me when I read these assessments that very confidently proclaim like there's nothing going on there, nothing to see here. I would just invite you to check out these types of things. And if you evaluate them and come to the conclusion, it doesn't matter, our assessment stands, then please give your reasoning. That would be really great. But otherwise, please don't take this as like too critical. I, of course, appreciate the report, and in particular, the economic relationship is very thoroughly studied in it. And I learned a lot about that there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we've all sat through enough panels where everyone agrees with each other. So I appreciate you sparking a bit of discussion here. John and Sergey, I'm going to give you guys the chance to respond in just a moment here, but Ambassador Herbst, you get to bat cleanup for us here in this discussion. Can you give us your thoughts on the paper and what's been discussed so far? And yeah, please unmute.
I'm very lucky in this case to be batting cleanup because I'm glad to hear Sarah's very smart intervention. And I'm going to take a position which is different from both the report and from Sarah, although more closely aligned with the report. All right. I think the specific argument Sarah makes is very important and needs to be put into the calculation about the more than visible cooperation between Russia and China as Moscow conducts this war of aggression in Ukraine. And that's because, and as I think Sergey and John would agree, they are working in tandem because they see the United States as their principal adversary. They share that view. And they share that view because they both want a world where American influence is reduced substantially, so Russia can work its will within the borders of the former Soviet Union, and China could work its will in the Western Pacific. And the cooperation regarding arms to Russia that Sarah details is an important part of this. But this still fits nicely, I think, within the framework that John and Sergey outlined. I think history is extremely important for suggesting the patterns by which nations operate. And it's invariably true, or almost invariably true, that when great nations share long borders, they're not friends. And that has been true in Russian Chinese history for centuries. And there was a period which resembles this one, where Russia and China seemed to be working in tandem because they shared an enemy. That enemy happened to be the United States. And this was after Mao took over in Beijing. And I am not expert enough on that period to talk about the arms that were provided by Moscow to China and the limits on certain arms provided by Moscow to China and the economic support given by Moscow to China and the development of a nuclear program initially in China with Soviet expertise, but that was a factor. And that close cooperation directed against the United States lasted approximately 15 years. I mean, the strains in that relationship actually appeared within 10 years, because Mao was not too happy about Khrushchev's leadership in Moscow, and he thought he should have been the senior party because he was older than Khrushchev, and he thought Khrushchev was a blunderer. And within the early years of close cooperation, 15 years later, they were exchanging gunfire across the Ussuri River. Now, we're not at that stage in their relationship right now. Of course, they are overwhelmingly working together with some limitations against the United States. But even in this period of good feelings, Chinese journalists, Chinese historians, and I did some work on this 10 years ago, even a third secretary at the Chinese embassy in Islamabad were referring to Vladivostok by its Chinese name and insisting that there were large territories of China under the control of Russia. So that meant even as China was working with Russia in ways that both John and Sarah and Sergey, not both, all three of the other panelists described, China was marking out the conflict to come in the future. The cooperation is most importantly driven by Putin's weakness in Ukraine. So he doesn't want to talk about the tensions in the China-Russia relationship, but we've seen evidence of these tensions on the Russian side. The New York Times had an article, I don't know, a year plus ago, talking about an FSB report about Chinese infiltration into Russian industry and arms industry, which suggests that not all the stuff going to China of a military nature are going by the consent of the Russians. And we know that Russian analysts worry about the Chinese, but it's pretty clear in the current political environment in Moscow, they're not supposed to talk about that because the focus is on the enemy to the West. Bottom line, this relation, we'll talk about this later, so I'll wait till later to bring up the bottom line. I think this is temporary. It's pretty close right now, but let's just say, and here I'm coming back to what I'll talk about later. If Russia loses this war, if Russia loses this war in Ukraine, I don't know where that's coming from. Oh, that's coming from my iPad, excuse me. If Russia loses this war in Ukraine, by which Ukraine emerges as an independent country, secure and stable, that removes much of the basis for the partnership between China and Russia. And I suspect then the historical patterns will resume. And at that point, we may see the United States and Russia having a former partnership, dealing with the greater enemy to both of us.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. John, I want to go to you first, and then Sergey, just to respond to what's been said so far.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I want to thank Sarah for her robust challenge to our report. Of course, we welcome that sort of thing. It's good when experts disagree for the purposes of these webinars, but I'm not sure that we disagree that much. And I would certainly say in the case of Ukraine, undeniably, there is a level of military technical cooperation that can't be ignored. But in the case of Ukraine, I think what we notice is that, yes, the Chinese have said on the record that they don't wish to see Russia defeated in Ukraine, and I think for fairly obvious reasons. But it's not at all clear that they have an interest in a Russian victory that could end up destabilizing Europe and, of course, the European market for Chinese goods. So I think we have to consider that aspect that China is probably trying to seek some kind of sort of middle outcome here, where Russia gains enough but doesn't destroy Ukraine's independence and in the process inflict greater damage on Europe. So I keep that in mind. When it comes to dual-use goods, I think we can see also for military purposes, these have been extremely valuable. And I'm aware that I think it was at the beginning of 2023, there were vast exports or imports from China of bulldozers, for example, that we used to, as I understand it, to build the so-called Surovikin line. We obviously are aware of the volume of components from China that are in Russian drones and other weapon systems. And I do very much agree with your assessment that if it hadn't been for Chinese support, Russia would not be fighting the war today in the way that it is. So I'm not sure that we in fact disagree on that much. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Sergey, anything to add?
Yes, please. Sarah, thank you. Thank you for your very important thoughts. And as John, I do not see big disagreements with you on facts, but I have a different interpretation. Because we, in our report, we try to look like helicopter view on Russia-China relations. And we do not put a big of emphasis on Ukrainian war, on war in Ukraine. Yeah, yes, it's very important. And I cannot dispute that for Russian army, it would be very difficult to fight without having access to Chinese components, electronics, and so on and so forth. That's true. But we may look on media reports from Ukraine, from Russian investigators. A lot of Western components are in Russian drones and Russian missiles. Do we say that the West supports Russia in its war in Ukraine? No, it's about business. Russian companies, they need chips designed 20, 25 years ago for their missiles. They're not sophisticated. Nobody in China, nobody in the world controls their trade. It's like peanuts. Yeah, you may purchase it like in unlimited amounts. And that's true. That's true. Russia is not able to produce it. Russia desperately needs to purchase them from China. But once again, it's about the war. It's not about partnership. It's about private interest of Chinese companies to get access to Russian markets and to sell what they can. It's very similar to the situation about sanctions imposed on Russia when we say, oh, Putin, he's great. Russia is able to avoid sanctions to face them. No, it's not Putin. It's not the government. It's Russian business. Because business has very primitive goal. It wants to earn money. And if Chinese car producers were able to penetrate Russian market in the end 22, beginning 23, to sell huge amounts of cars, they did it. And you see the jump in Chinese export to Russia in 2023, it was caused by cars. Nevertheless, by the end of that year, Russia changed its tax regime, imposed additional fees on imported cars, and Chinese thought, okay, stop, we don't want to do it, it's not profitable anymore. And the amount of Chinese cars sold in Russia declined significantly. So we should separate trade, economic beneficial interest from long-term partnership. I agree with you that from a strategic viewpoint, from military viewpoint, the transfer of Russian technologies of submarines or of anything else, it's very important for the development of Chinese industry, of Chinese military capabilities. But it tells us nothing about partnership. I don't know a lot about this issue. But I think that it is a trade between Putin and Xi. Okay, you give us access to your technologies because we are not able to develop it. Yeah, China has some limitations in civil aviation, in not significantly in space, but still they need some access to Russian technology in space. Of course, they need access to Russian submarines technologies, airborne landing, maybe something else. But that's okay, guys, give us your technology. But China does not give anything in response. There is no joint ventures that will build submarines for China and Russian use. And there is no any word that China will produce submarines for Russia or vice versa. For me, it's a trade between Putin and Xi. Can we tell it partnership? Okay. We may say, but Russia does not benefit anything except of supporting its war in Ukraine. As if and when the war in Ukraine stops, China will have technology, Russia will have nothing. Is it partnership? Is it cooperation? I don't agree.
Thank you, Sergey. I want to flag two things. John mentioned Chinese bulldozers, or China sending bulldozers to Russia to build the Surovikin line. Our panelist who couldn't be here today, Joseph Webster, has a great piece from a few years ago on exactly this, tracking those trade flows. So I commend that piece to everyone here. And then the second piece is, we're a little over halfway through our discussion here, so I encourage our audience to keep sending in their questions to askac.org, and I will pick a few in the last maybe 15 minutes here to give to our panelists. I have a couple more questions for our folks here. And Sarah, I know you're itching to get back in the conversation here. I wonder if you're welcome to comment on what's been said, but I would also love the European perspective on the Russia-China partnership. I think we see Europe doing a pretty good job in pushing back on Russian aggression, but maybe less so on the China angle. How does Europe see the Russia-China partnership?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up actually. So what I see in Europe is there are different views on this partnership between Russia and China, but I think it's from my perspective at least, it looks like it's mostly diplomats who have this view that it's that China could maybe be used to rein in Russia. So that is basically a bit opposite to what you often hear from Americans. Nobody, I think, in Europe would say you could use Russia to rein in China. So that is not an opinion I've heard anyone utter. But it's mostly diplomats who have this idea. And among the analyst community, there's I think, an overwhelming feeling consensus that there's no use trying to go for a wedge strategy. It's a non-starter. So that is mostly what I hear, coming both from Russia specialists in Europe and from China specialists, so from both sides, because of the overwhelming synergies that both of these regimes, one should say, as long as Xi Jinping and Putin remain in power, at least. So these two people and their priorities are just very much aligned. And I was going to mention on the historical friction that was brought up by Ambassador Herbst. I am based in Germany. Let me tell you, there were a lot of territorial issues between allies like Germany and Poland, or Germany and France, and a history of hundreds of years of warfare. So this doesn't really convince me to say China and Russia have like some historical territorial disputes and therefore they can't work together, because in the NATO alliance, look at Greece and Turkey, for God's sake. So we have a lot of these partnerships within our alliance that are basically characterized by much the same dynamics and that flare up continuously. We've recently seen the Greenland scenario, I mean, this is another thing. The Danes are taking it deadly seriously, I can say. The Danes are not amused at all by this American attempt to, make a claim on Greenland. It is taken very seriously in Denmark and causing a lot of friction. Then also the thing about asymmetry. Why is it an issue for two allies to be asymmetrical in power or size or whatnot? I mean, who is the peer to the United States in the NATO alliance? isn't every single ally of the United States in an asymmetrical position towards the United States? I mean, I'm just pointing this out, it's just, I feel that we sometimes use a little bit of a strawman argument approach and making all kinds of unrealistic criteria that an alliance or a partnership has to fulfill to be somehow viable. But if you look at the reality of it within NATO, a lot of these criteria aren't met anyway, and then the durability aspect. This is my last point. I would like to ask, does it matter how durable such a partnership is? Is that really somehow important? Because to me, the most dangerous and problematic partnership that I can think of in our history was the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And how long did it last? Just a couple years. It was a very short-lived agreement before Germany turned on Russia. But look what they accomplished together. They started a world war together. So in that sense, I wonder whether it is in any way reassuring to have a diagnosis to say, this may not be durable, this may not last for 20 or more years. Isn't it more important to look at what's the potential for disruption, even if it only lasts for 5 years?
Thank you, Sarah. And I appreciate you making my job a little easier and asking some of these questions here. Ambassador Herbst, can we bring you in on this, on the territorial question? Does that truly matter? And then perhaps the durability of the China-Russia partnership.
Okay, yes. I agree that historical analogies need to be constructed carefully. And I think there's literally no basis for comparison. There's only basis for contrast between looking at the resolution, at least for a substantial period of time, of historic conflicts in Europe and the situation regarding former conflicts in Eurasia, specifically between Russia and China. The reason why many of the historic conflicts in Europe ceased after World War II was because of the creation of NATO, which was a world historic achievement. And we know that countries that wanted to become members of NATO after the Soviet Union fell apart had to resolve historic conflicts they had with their neighbors, like between Romania and Hungary. But as you correctly point out, Sarah, these conflicts still persist amongst NATO members. We see it especially between Greece and Turkey. But nonetheless, they're contained by the broader historical requirements. There aren't such broader historical requirements regarding Russia-China, except their opposition to America's still preeminent role in the world. Conceivably, this could keep them together for 40 or 50 years. But if the principal driver of that, which again is Putin's misbegotten adventure in Ukraine and the need for Chinese support, disappears, then the principal reason for them being together disappears with it, and the historical norm reverts. So what I've just said obviously could be wrong, but I think a careful look at history suggests that's a stronger argument. But having said all that, maybe we are spending too much time fussing about analyses and not enough time talking about policy. Because you're right, Sarah, and I think John and Sergei agree that the Russia-Chinese entente, which may be a little bit too close of a description. By the way, I would describe it not as a marriage without love, but I'd describe it as a common law marriage without love of the China-Russia relationship today, suggesting it's not quite so sturdy. But making pressure on especially Russia for its savage aggression in Ukraine is the best way to test and to break that relationship. Because Russia does not have vital interests in conquering Ukraine. Putin may have vital interests, which now relate to his own longevity in the Kremlin. But the Russian people have not rallied to this war. And it would not take too much for us to put overwhelming pressure on Putin, meaning in terms of advanced weapons to Ukraine, harsher sanctions on Russia, and deciding properly and swiftly to get all the remaining frozen Russian state assets to Ukraine. Do that, that makes Russia's position or Putin's position in Ukraine probably untenable over time. And that will put serious pressure on the entente between Beijing and Moscow, because there are Russians who understand that China is a danger to their hold in the Far East.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. I think our audience is quite absorbed by this discussion, because we have a question that I'm going to lead off with here that Ambassador Herbst touches on the Far East question. And Sarah, I'm going to pitch it to you because it is on the territorial claims between Russia and China. This comes from Mitchell Aldrich, who asks, some observe an inexorable absorption of Russian lands into Chinese hands, with long-term leases supplemented with Chinese labor in the same Siberian and Far Eastern lands. Does that not suggest that China has designs on Russia to reconstruct a, quote, historic Chinese lands more than just a relationship of convenience or equality? Sarah, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think if you look at China, they have definitely designs on the Russian Arctic. They are very, very interested in gaining a military presence, in particular for submarine basing in the Russian Arctic. But they can only do this with Russian permission and with Russian support. It's not doable without that. So in their view, they can easily gain any kind of de facto influence in the Russian Far East just through their overwhelming, you could say, financial, economic firepower. They don't need to conquer that or annex that territory. They can just dominate it economically without alienating Russia and endangering what is far more interesting and important for China, gaining access to this highly sensitive territory that Russia does not necessarily want to open to China. But if you look at it, they have started to do that. They have concluded a memorandum with the Chinese Coast Guard. The FSB Coast Guard has concluded an agreement with the Chinese Coast Guard for a presence, normalizing a paramilitary Chinese presence in those waters. And they have actually let them be there and do policing missions together, which is a bit absurd given that there's no policing in that sense to be done of Murmansk, but still, they have concluded this agreement. And this is just, I think, this argument overlooks, again, as I said, overlooks other evidence that needs to be weighed against it. And that's just that some journalist or some scholar brings up historical grievances should also not be considered state policy. It is always nice, in relationships like China's and Russia's, to bring up pressure points and to use these arguments and bring up old grievances. But you will see the same thing in many different countries as well. It's not unique to China, Russia. And on the other hand, the conflicts between China and Russia, if you look at what happened there, it really, the historical effects really pale in comparison to what China experienced, for instance, with Japan, in terms of the atrocities and the national humiliation, the national memory of that. So I do think we tend to over-exaggerate a little bit the meaning of the Far East from the Chinese point of view. At least that's my reading, that the Chinese state leadership is not going to endanger its overall interest in whatever Russia can provide, in particular real estate, by going for that. And just consider from the Russian point of view, if they were genuinely afraid of Chinese military threats or military invasion threats, would they be able to put the vast amount of their military resources on the other side of Russia into the Ukraine war? No, they would not. They would definitely need to keep forces on station and keep China in check. But they're not doing that. They have put the vast amount of their military into the Ukraine war. And this is only possible because there's no actual fear in Russia right now that they could actually be invaded by China.
All right. Mr. Loft, the next question is for you, and this comes from John Keogh, who asks, what do you think of the so-called reverse Kissinger argument of Washington trying to peel Moscow away from China? He asks, is this likely or unlikely to succeed? And I would ask, is it even good policy?
Well, my short answer is that it's a fantasy. I don't see any possibility of that happening at this stage. But I do very much agree with Ambassador Herbst's view that if and when this war in Ukraine comes to an end, I think we're going to see some significant change in the dynamics between China and Russia. And at some point, there will be a restoration of relations between Russia and Europe. We can't see that at the moment, as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, and who knows, it may take another iteration in the Kremlin after Putin leaves before we reach that point. But Russia historically gravitates to Europe as a source of ideas, of modernization. And as we mentioned in the report, the Russian elites still, we believe, identify very strongly with Europe in a way that they don't with China. So I absolutely agree with what Sarah has just said about the Far East, that there is no security threat that is, I think, perceived by Moscow from China at the moment. But over time, there may be challenges that emerge, and they may simply be related to Russia's demography, to Chinese economic expansion, to Chinese interests in Central Asia and elsewhere. This is a complicated picture, but my view is that to manage the relationship with China, Russia, in fact, needs to have a functioning relationship with Europe and indeed the United States.
Thanks, John. Next question. This comes from Jonathan Ramsey, who asks, how does Beijing view the ongoing U.S. facilitated, he writes, peace talks to try to end Russia's war on Ukraine? Does China want peace in Ukraine, or does it benefit from Russia continuing the war? Sergey, do you want to take a stab at that, or Ambassador Herbst?
Okay, in my mind, the answer is very short. In words, Beijing wants the war to stop, because if you read any declaration of Chinese leaders, of President Xi, yes, we need peace, we need peace, we need peace. So no doubts. But once again, as many is hidden under the table, China benefits from this war, not economically. Finally, we calculated that overall discount to Russian oil, if it is even $15 per barrel, China's economy benefit up to $20 billion a year. For the economy whose size is 18 trillion, okay, 20 billion is huge money. It's huge money. But for the economy, it's nobody can see it. Yeah, but China can monitor what West is doing. What is Western policy when one big country invades another small country? And we can see the analogy. So China is reluctant to see what's going on. China does not support peace negotiations. China initially, if I remember correctly, maybe 24 months ago, they had some peace plans, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs was visiting Moscow and Kiev, trying to broker the deal. But they failed and said, okay, it's not our war. It's not our war. Do what you want.
Ambassador Herbst, anything to add there?
I think that China, here's where I don't necessarily agree with the report. I think China would not be unhappy if Russia were to win this war. And I think that for sure it's a benefit to China that we are paying a fair amount of attention to the war in Ukraine, although not as much in my judgment as we should be paying to it. And I agree with leaders of former leaders of Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea that the best way to deter Xi from moving on Taiwan is to defeat Putin in Ukraine. So Xi looks at what we do, the United States in particular, but the West in general, in Ukraine to see if the leaders have the gumption, the spine, to defend their interests in a serious way. And that's why we have a large stake, which goes beyond Europe in making sure Putin does not win in Ukraine. Just one more point regarding the relationship between Russia and China itself. Of course, Russia has taken its troops from the Far East to deal with the war in Ukraine because they've been unable to take Ukraine with the force structure they had in place initially. And this is clearly Putin's E-Day fix, his number one objective. But that doesn't mean they don't understand that there's a danger from China, which could be realized at a future point. You know, I referred to that article in the New York Times, but there's also the fact that the FSB arrested a whole host of Russian scientists who they believe had been co-opted by the Chinese. So the people who in the security apparatus in Russia understand that China is a danger to them. They just don't see it as the principal danger at this moment. And so I think we should not ignore this fact. And I see this again as an indicator that historic patterns will return.
Thank you. Interesting question here, and Sarah, I think this one is for you. I think you've painted a picture of the Russia-China partnership that's a little maybe more durable than many think in many respects. And so this question comes from Gina Snyder. What steps can the US or Europe or the West take to strategically undermine the China-Russia partnership?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Ambassador Hurst said. That is actually the best approach that we could choose is to fully support Ukraine and make sure that the Russians get a bloody nose, that they are not able to reach their goals, that they don't get rewarded for this invasion. This would at the same time achieve two goals. It would achieve probably a good deterrent effect against any Chinese adventurism towards Taiwan, because it would add some risk to the Chinese risk calculus, that you can never know how such a war will go, and that may be just too risky to try something like that. And on the other hand, it would diminish the status of Putin in the eyes of the Chinese government, because I do think China is already looking at Putin differently than it did before the Ukraine war. I think Putin had a status of a rogue, a daring, brave, bold leader, daring to challenge, also militarily assert himself in Chechnya and in all these previous, in Georgia, in these Crimea takeover wars, where he basically showed boldness and was successful, militarily successful. So he had a bit of a status of a military genius. And then this war in Ukraine failed so miserably. And I do believe that the Chinese were told initially, look, this is going to be like a regime change operation. We're going to go in there. It's going to be 3 weeks, and then we will make Ukraine into something akin to Belarus. And the Chinese were probably on board with that plan. And when it backfired on Russia, as it did, and the Ukrainians fought back so valiantly and so successfully, I do believe Putin had a lot of explaining to do. And I have heard from inside China that the status of he himself has also suffered because of his decision to align China so closely with Putin and these war goals, because a lot of Chinese experts and diplomats are not fans of this war. So this is, and also not fans of Putin's necessarily. So this is something I believe has the potential, if we could get a result where Ukraine prevails and Russia really doesn't get rewarded for this invasion in any way. This would really mean that the weakening of this bond between Russia and China could be achieved, that even a weakening also of the status of Xi Jinping inside his own system could maybe be achieved. And we could avert the danger that it will be a precedent for starting an invasion of Taiwan. So I completely agree, and this should be like our main focus in trying to deal with the Russia-China relationship.
Thank you, Sarah. We're running short on time here, but anyone else with any quick fire ideas on how to muck up the gears in the Russia-China partnership? If not, perfectly fine. One final question here, very quick one for Sergey. This is an anonymous one from our audience here. The Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, how likely is this to happen in the medium term?
What we see, it's not very likely, because Chinese government has plans for supplying gas, imported gas, until 2030, and there is no shortage of gas for China for this moment. Any further plans, even for 2035, they have some ideas how to fill their demand, and there is no space for Russian gas until 2033. So anything else will be discussed after 2030, when China will revisit their plans.
Thank you very much. All right, I think we have to call it there. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us today, and thank you to our audience for attending what has been quite quite an engaging discussion. I've learned a lot and had a lot of fun here. For more on Russia, I encourage everyone to check out the Atlantic Council's Russia Tomorrow report series. That's Russia Tomorrow, for the latest and greatest analysis on the future of Russia from top experts, including on these pertinent Russia-China questions. That's all the time we have today. Thank you again, and join us again soon at the Atlantic Council.